And I says, well, I'll tell you what, let's do. I says, if you think I'm kidding, I said, what do you say tomorrow morning, each one of us walk into a bookstore and ask for a book that we know does not exist. We're going to create it here. It does not exist. Let's just see what happens. Because the day man will believe that it is. And let's see how it works. I said, now look, since we're all in this together, what do you say now? We're going to make this a communal affair. And I'm not... You give me a suggestion for a title. Just call it in. And millions of calls. They were coming from, at night, the 50,000-watt station at 4 in the morning. I'm getting calls from Alaska. And these guys are giving me all these suggestions for titles. And finally, at 4:30 in the morning, it was getting so late, I had to go off at 5:30. I said, okay, it's closed. I picked the title. And some unknown guy called in this title, Libertine. I said, now that sounds like a book. I mean, it could be almost anything. Libertine. I said, now, I'm going to create you got to have an author. Because today, most people, they say, if you read the newest Faulkner, Jacqueline Suzanne's a big deal, You've got to have an author. All right, I'll create an author. And I sat for a minute, and it just hit me, the name. I says, okay, the author's name is Frederick Ewing. Frederick Roland Ewing. He's British. He was a lieutenant commander in World War II on the North Atlantic, the Murmansk Run. He is now a civil servant in Rhodesia. He is married to Marjorie, a horsewoman from the North Country. He writes extensively for The Observer, and he is known primarily for his pre-World War II broadcasts on the third program of the BBC, 18th Century Erotica. And he's a scholar, and Libertine is the first volume of a trilogy on 18th century English court life. And by the way, Mr. Ewing is quite surprised at the success his book is enjoying, since it was written primarily for scholars. People do not misunderstand certain chapters that are there for the purpose of scholarly research. And I said, just go in and say, I would like Ewing's Libertine. I says, and if anybody asks you, it was printed by Excelsior Press, which, by the way, is a subsidiary of Cambridge University Imprint. I said, there is not a bookseller in the country that can argue with Cambridge. And a British author who's married to a lady named Marjorie. I says, now you go in and don't crack a smile. Don't do anything. And when the man says to you, the first thing, I says, he's also bound by lists. The first thing he'll do, you'll walk in and say, I would like to have a copy of Libertine by Frederick Ewing. And he'll say, who published it? You say, Excelsior Press. Oh, yes, of course. Yes. Just a moment. And he'll take out a list, and he'll look it up, and he'll see that it is not listed. He will turn to you and say, there's no such book. You say, well, I'll go to Doubleday's then, and leave. Well, the next guy that comes in and asks for this, he'll say, it's on order. And the third one that comes in, he's going to be on his phone calling the distributor. Yeah. And the distributor's going to say to him, you're out of your bird, Fred. You're being put on. There's no such book. I've got the big list here. And there's nothing like that. Well, if 422 bookstores call in, he's going to be calling Publishers Weekly. And within 20 minutes, Publishers Weekly has collapsed in a pile of rubble. And remember, it's a $6.95 book. They don't laugh at a $7 book. I says, now get out and go, and we'll sit back and see what happens. Now remember, every listener knew that book did not exist. And they knew it didn't exist. I says, now remember, it does not exist. You know this, and let's see what happens. And I says, you let me know tomorrow morning and the day after that, give me reports, and I will give them out to the listeners, what's happening. Sure enough, the next day a guy says, he says, for years, this guy in this 8th Street bookstore with this beard has had me totally buffaloed. I mean, he stands back of that cash register, and you have a feeling that he wrote Kierkegaard. That he was behind Schopenhauer when Schopenhauer wrote this stuff, and he says, he used to say things like this. I'd go in and I'd say, there's something about Marcel Proust, and he says, well, of course, Proust never matured. And he says, He says, I went in there today, and I said to this guy, I'd like a copy of I, Libertine by Ewing. And he says he looked up from behind the cash register and said, Ewing, it's about time the public discovered him. He says, the scales fell from my eyes. He says, I learned something. And I'm getting these calls from people up. One woman wrote in, and she, 2 days later, she says she was sitting in her bridge party, and she just casually mentioned, gee, I've been reading I, Libertine. And 3 ladies started to discuss it. They not only had read it, they finished it, and 2 of them didn't like it. And so she says, and then I got a letter from a kid at 2 weeks later. They're coming in from all over the country saying what's happening is that people are hearing this, airline pilots were listening. It was spreading to Paris, Rome, Japan, every place else. And a guy wrote me a letter. He says, Shepard, he says, don't say anything about this. He says, look at this. And he enclosed in this envelope, he says, I'm a student at a university which I shall not name. It's in Jersey. I'll pick a pen name. Let's think of some funny name. Rutgers. He was a student at this non-existent school called Rutgers thing. And he says, I'm in this English, this history of English writing course. And he said, I wrote a term paper on F.R. Ewing, eclectic historian. And it was about a 9-page paper with footnotes, quotes from Ewing's earlier BBC broadcasts, references. And the thing, he sent it to me, and it had a big red thing on the front of it. It said, superb research. He got a B+.
Always a B+.
Yeah,
Never an
and
A.
the guy says, he says, what? He says, my whole education is probably phony. He says, but there wasn't even a Chaucer. This could have been some guy 400 years ago, putting the whole world on. So all of it, and I says, wait, let's sit back. I says, don't say anything, just keep asking. Well, do you know within 4 weeks there was a piece appeared in the Earl Wilson column. It said, had lunch with Freddie Ewing on his way to India with his wife Marjorie. Oh, no. I'm not kidding you. And I begin to get frightened, because it's like a guy who stands at the base of a mountain, and he says to himself, gee, I wonder what would happen if I threw a pebble up there. And he throws one up there, and the next thing you know, he's got a 420 trillion ton avalanche coming down on him. It's just incredible. This thing pyramided. And so I began to get all over. Do you know that at the end of the 6th week, one of the funniest things that happened, that one of the book supplements, at that time there were 3 book supplements published with Sunday newspapers in New York. There was the New York Times book supplement, and there were 2 others. One of the book supplements had a review of I, Libertine.
Now, how could that have happened?
Well, now, here's what I said. Now, wait a minute. Now, that goes into later. Now, this is the truth. I've got it all in clippings.
I know it's the truth.
Now, how it happened was my listeners all over the place, even book reviewers, were foisting it on people. Oh. They were calling up editors, I'd like to review this new book. And see, listeners were beginning to throw their, and I says, any place you can throw your little hooker in, let's do it and see what happens. So some PR man wrote to one of the columnists, and next thing you know, they're having lunch with Freddie Ewing.